Twan Huijsmans, welcome in NaspRead. Your research focuses on the urban-rural contrast in the electoral behavior. US studies particularly show that the left is urban and the right is rural. Is this an old divisive factor coming back, or is it something new?
Yeah, you're right. So this is certainly not completely new. So in many European democracies, there have always been specific parties that did slightly better in cities, like Social Democrats, and parties that have relatively strong support in rural areas, like Christian Democrats, for example. And in the US, there's also always been a slight difference where Democrats did somewhat better in cities. But we see across many countries that these differences between urban and rural areas have increased over the last decades. So in the US, the UK, and Canada, the major party of the left increasingly gets its support from cities, and the major party of the right increasingly gets its support from rural areas. And in the European multi-party systems, we see similar patterns, but it looks a bit differently because we see a decline of support for the traditional center-left and center-right parties. And these parties used to get broad support from lots of different places. But instead, now the support for the new left and the new right parties grew, and these new left parties, like the Greens or social liberal parties, they get their support increasingly from urban areas, while the new right parties, for example, radical right parties, increasingly get their support from places outside of the larger cities. So it's not new, but it has definitely increased in many countries over the last decades.
Basing on your studies, why is that? Why is it increasing in many countries?
Well, we think this has to do with the increasing salience of cultural issues like immigration and integration issues in the political debates across many countries, because these are the issues that inhabitants of urban and rural areas are divided on most clearly. So if preferences on these issues become a stronger motivation for vote choice, then the urban-rural electoral divide increases. On top of that, there is also the increasing salient issue of climate change, where urban and rural inhabitants also somewhat differ in their attitudes, and which has also direct consequences for industrial and agricultural sectors that are often located outside of the larger cities.
Are there countries where this divisive factor is more evident than ours?
We see that it increases across many countries, but there are definitely differences in how strong this increase is. So this is especially strong in the United States and countries with similar political systems like the UK and Canada, while across European multi-party democracies, we see some more variation. So there are some countries like Switzerland, Norway, and Denmark, where we see relatively high and strongly increasing urban-rural electoral divides. But also some countries like Spain and Italy, where we see that these urban-rural divides are not so strong compared to other European countries.
In the recent years, in Italy, but also in Europe in general, we are seeing a wave of support for the extreme right. How much does this specific political outcome depend on the phenomenon you just described?
Yeah, so the rise of the radical right is related to increasing urban-rural electoral divides, in the sense that these types of parties perform increasingly well outside of the larger cities. So, for example, the radical right Party for Freedom in the Netherlands started out with most of their support coming from large cities and suburbs, but it is increasingly doing well in other types of places. And the same applies to the Alternative for Germany or the Rassemblement National in France. Especially in France, the radical right becomes more and more a party of the rural areas. So this is in line with what we see in public opinion in many countries. So inhabitants of places outside of the larger cities in general have less cosmopolitan attitudes. And they are somewhat more dissatisfied with politics, partly because they think that national politicians do not care enough about their place or their region. But on the other hand, if you look more closely, I think the geography of the European far right is much more complex, because it varies not only between urban and rural areas, but also between more central, economically booming regions and more peripheral areas within countries. And it is also important to note that although we do see that inhabitants of urban and rural places do increasingly differ in their cultural attitudes, for example, towards immigration, this doesn't mean that inhabitants of rural areas became more nationalist over time. It just means that inhabitants of cities became more cosmopolitan, so more open towards immigration. So the fact that the radical right does increasingly well outside of cities doesn't mean that people there became more nationalist. It is more because this cultural nationalism is a more salient political theme nowadays, and because these radical right parties succeed in mobilizing political dissatisfaction better than other parties do.